There is a specific kind of silence that fills a hearing room when a senator uses a witness's own words against them, not hostile words. Not words spoken in a moment of anger or carelessness that a political opponent has seized upon and weaponized. Words the witness chose deliberately, words that were supposed to serve a specific purpose, in a specific context, for a specific audience, and that are now serving an entirely different purpose in front of an entirely different audience. That silence fell over the committee room the moment Gary Peters opened the file. Markwayne Mullin had been performing well all morning. That is the honest assessment, not a concession, not a political compliment, but an accurate description of what was happening in that hearing room before Peters picked up the file. Multiple members of the committee had pressed him on his record, on his positions, on the specific decisions and statements that his opponents had identified as vulnerabilities heading into this proceeding. He had handled all of it with the composure of someone who had anticipated the attacks and prepared for them. He is not an inexperienced figure. He has been in Washington long enough to understand how these proceedings work, how to manage hostile questioning, how to stay on message when the questions are designed to pull you off it. He had arrived prepared, he had his lines ready. He had the confidence of someone who had thought carefully about what was coming and had constructed responses that could handle it. What he had not constructed a response for was a document he had written himself. Senator Gary Peters of Michigan had been quiet through the early rounds of questioning. This is worth noting. In a hearing room full of members competing for time and camera presence and the opportunity to deliver the line that will circulate afterward, deliberate patience is a choice. It costs something. It requires the discipline to let the proceeding develop around you without inserting yourself into it, to wait for the moment you have prepared for, rather than taking the easier moments available. Along the way, Peters had waited, he had listened, he had observed, he had let the morning develop the way mornings and Senate hearings develop through the predictable back and forth of members asking the questions their positions require them to ask and witnesses delivering the answers their positions require them to give. And then Peters picked up the file. He did not identify it immediately. He held it the way experienced interrogators hold documents they intend to use, present in the room, visible on the desk, acknowledged by its physical existence before its contents become the subject of discussion. Mullin noticed it, the slight change in his posture, barely perceptible, visible only to someone who had been watching carefully, was the first indication that he recognized something about what Peters was holding before Peters had said a single word about it. Peters asked 3 setup questions before he touched the file. Each one was straightforward on its surface. Each one invited Mullin to characterize his own record on a specific issue in his own words. Each one was phrased in a way that gave Mullin every opportunity to be precise and specific about his position. Mullin took the opportunity. He answered all 3 with the kind of clarity and confidence that had carried him through the morning. He defined his position. He explained his reasoning. He placed himself, on the record, exactly where he wanted to be placed. Then Peters opened the file. He turned to a specific page. He located a specific section, and he began to read from a document that the FBI had compiled, a document that contained, among other things, a detailed account of statements Mullin himself had made in a prior official context, statements that had been recorded and preserved and were now reproduced in the federal file that Peters was holding. What those statements said was not consistent with what Mullin had just told the committee. Not in the way that politicians sometimes say different things in different contexts and can argue that each statement, properly understood, reflects a coherent underlying position. In a direct, specific, documentable way that did not require interpretation to perceive. Mullin had said one thing in the official context that generated the FBI report. He had said it to federal investigators. He had said it in a setting where the legal and institutional weight of his words was clearly established. He had said something meaningfully different to the committee 60 seconds earlier. Both were now on the record, in the same room, in the same transcript, separated by 60 seconds and a file that Peters had been holding on his desk. Since the hearing began, Peters looked up from the file. He asked Mullin, which the count was accurate. 8 seconds passed. Those 8 seconds were the loudest moment in a hearing that had been running for nearly 2 hours, because in those 8 seconds, Mullin was doing something that every experienced observer of Senate proceedings learns to recognize. He was running through his options in real time, assessing what each available response would cost him, and trying to find a path through a situation that had been carefully constructed to have no clean exit. There was no clean exit. This is the thing about a well-constructed evidentiary exchange in a Senate hearing that most political coverage misses. The drama is not in the confrontation. It is in the architecture that makes the confrontation unavoidable. Peters had spent time, real time, serious preparation time, building a sequence that placed Mullin on the record about his current position before revealing what the prior record showed. By the time the file came out, the trap had already closed. The 8 seconds of silence were not suspense. They were the sound of a man discovering there is no door. The document was in Peters' hands. It had been read into the record, the statements it contained, Mullin's own statements, in his own words, generated in an official context. that gave them a specific legal and institutional weight were now part of the permanent transcript of this hearing. Whatever Mullin said next would be measured against them. When he finally responded, what came out was careful, more careful than anything he had said all morning. The forward confidence of the earlier exchanges gave way to something more qualified, more hedged, more reliant on language that preserved options rather than committed to positions. He suggested that context mattered, that the prior statements had been made in a different setting with a different purpose, that the two accounts properly understood were not as contradictory as they might appear. Peters let him finish. Then he read the relevant passage from the FBI file one more time. To understand why a document of this kind carries the weight it carries, you need to understand what an FBI report actually is and how it comes to exist. When the FBI conducts an interview, the agents create a written record of what was said. Most people have a vague understanding of this process. Fewer people understand what it actually produces and what weight that product carries in the American legal and institutional system. That record is not a rough summary or an impressionistic account assembled from memory after the fact. It is a formal document reviewed, approved, and entered into the official case file of the federal government. It is the kind of document that is used in federal prosecutions, the kind that is subject to disclosure obligations in legal proceedings, the kind whose accuracy carries institutional weight precisely because the consequences of inaccuracy are severe. When a statement appears in an FBI report, it is there because the professional agents who conducted the interview determined that it accurately represented what was said. It is not an allegation. It is not a characterization. It is the official federal record of what a person said in an official federal context. Markwayne Mullin's statements were in that record, and they said what they said. There is a version of this exchange that would have been less effective, the version where the senator raises his voice, where he delivers a speech about accountability and the public trust and the obligations of officials who appear before Congress, where the document becomes a prop and a performance rather than the center of a precise, controlled evidentiary presentation. Peters did not take that approach. His approach throughout this exchange was notable not for its aggression, but for its precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize about the significance of the discrepancy he had identified. He did not deliver a speech about accountability or the public interest or the obligations of public officials to be consistent in their representations to federal investigators and to congressional committees. He simply read the document, and then he asked the question that the document made necessary. That restraint was deliberate. It was also more effective than any performance could have been, because a speech can be dismissed as political. An accusation can be reframed as partisan, but a document, read out loud, without commentary, in the specific, neutral language of an official federal record, that is something different, that lands differently. It landed in that hearing room the way it was designed to land, not with noise. With weight. Mullin attempted 2 more approaches before Peters' time expired. He questioned whether the FBI report accurately captured the full context of the interview in which the statements had been made. Peters noted that the document included a certification by the interviewing agents attesting to its accuracy and that Mullin had been given an opportunity to review and correct the record at the time. He suggested that his prior statements and his current testimony were reconcilable if the committee considered the full scope of the relevant background. Peters asked him to identify the specific point of reconciliation. Mullin did not identify it. Peters moved to his final question. He asked Mullin directly and on the record whether he stood by the statements contained in the FBI report. The answer Mullin gave was not yes. It was not no. It was a carefully constructed non-answer that occupied the space between them long enough to fill the time, precise enough to avoid an outright contradiction, and ultimately empty enough that it answered nothing. Peters noted that the non-answer would appear in the transcript alongside the document. It will. It does. This is what oversight is supposed to look like, and so rarely does. Most oversight hearings are performances. Both sides arrive with their conclusions already formed. The questions are designed not to discover truth, but to produce a record that supports the conclusion each side came in with. The witnesses know this, the members know this, the staffers know this, and the proceedings unfold accordingly, generating more heat than light, more noise than accountability. This was different. Not the theatrical version that fills most congressional hearings, 2 sides performing for their respective audiences, generating clips, building a record that serves political rather than institutional purposes. The version where a senator does the work, finds the document, reads it, and asks the question the document demands be asked. The version where the witness's own prior statements become the instrument of accountability, not because someone assembled them as a political weapon, but because they exist in the official federal record, and they say something specific, and they cannot be wished away by a sufficiently polished non-answer. Gary Peters found the file that Markwayne Mullin had forgotten about, or perhaps had not forgotten, perhaps had simply calculated that no one would find it, or find it in time, or find it in a form that could be used in this specific proceeding in this specific way. That calculation was wrong. Peters found it. His staff found it. Someone did the work of going through the federal record carefully enough to locate the document, understand its significance, and build a line of questioning around it that would make its contents impossible to explain away. He opened it in public. He read what was in it, and Mullin, for all of his preparation, and all of his experience, and all of the careful work his team had done to get him ready for this morning, had no defense for what his own words said. That is the power of the document. It does not care how prepared you are. It does not care how experienced you are. It does not care how carefully you have constructed the story you want to tell. It only cares about what you actually said, and what Markwayne Mullin actually said is in the federal record now. It was there before this hearing began. Peters just made sure the committee knew it to all of it. On the record permanently and Mullin, sitting 6 feet away with no answer that could close the distance between what the file said and what he had just told the Senate, had nothing left to offer but the silence that followed the question. The file did the rest. So, what do you think about that moment, when Gary Peters read directly from the FBI file, and Markwayne Mullin had to respond to his own words? Was there any real way out of that situation, or do you think there's still context behind those statements that we're not seeing here? Let me know your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more breakdowns of the moments where the record speaks louder than anything else, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Capital Clash so you don't miss what comes next.